So this fabric I have prepped for a whip stitch sample. A whip stitch is also known as a hemming stitch, just goes along this inside edge of the fold and it whips around that corner. Sometimes this is used in pants, in skirts, anything where you would be hemming a garment. And it's one of the few hand stitches where you'll stitch through all layers, both the external, the right side, it's the outside of the garment, and the folded inner layer of your seam allowance. So you'll hold it in a way that allows you to have your needle in your dominant hand and your fabric in your non-dominant hand. So as a right-handed person, I'll hold my needle in my right and my fabric in my left, and I'll start close to me and work away from me. If I was left-handed, I would hold the fabric in my non-dominant hand and a needle in my dominant hand, and I would still start close to myself and work away from myself. So for the whip stitch, we'll start all of these stitches the same way, much like when we did the knotting video, where I'm going to hide my knot in my thread on the inside of this fold, just to kind of keep it out of view. But then before I start my stitch, I will do one double locking stitch through to the outside. So a small little pick stitch. So if I were to flip this and look on the right side, I have just that same little flash of silver. So I'll pull my thread down to a small loop and go through it twice in the same direction. And that's just a good way to start any of your hand stitching, so that all of your layers are nice and attached when you start your stitch. So a whip stitch will work taking a small stitch through to the outside but coming up through the fold. And in order to keep it nice and neat on the inside and out of harm's way from heels or from toes or things that could snag at a hem, we're going to work in 1/4 inch increments. So a 1/4 inch away, I'll take a small pick stitch to the outside, and then I'll pivot and come up through the fold. So I'm working pretty minutely here. But before I complete this stitch, if I look at the right side, I have that same little small pick stitch that won't be very visible. Even though I'm working in contrast threads so that you guys can see it, if we're sewing on a theatrical garment or a real garment, we would match our thread to that garment. So now a 1/4 inch away, I'll take a small pick stitch to the outside and pivot a little bit to come through my fold. Just negotiate my threads through. One of the reasons why we don't take a big stitch and come up straight through the fold like that, that's easier, but you can see on the outside how big that stitch will be. Even on the stage, if you were sewing in something shiny or slinky like satin, that could be visible. And so we like to make things a lot sneakier than that. So a small pick stitch that comes up through the fold. Double check your work as you're getting used to sewing it. After a while, it becomes a little bit second nature. But as you're learning, making sure that you're looking at both sides of your work, otherwise you can be sadly surprised if you do a whole bunch of hand sewing, only to find out that your work is really too visible on the right side. So double check. And now's the part of the video where I speed it up so that you think I sew really, really fast. And then just taking those last few stitches to bring you towards the end of your hem. And I'll finish it the same way I started, by taking one last stitch, and then either through all layers or through the fold, I'll do a double locking stitch by wrapping my thread around the needle and pulling it tight. So then that way you have a nice neat whip stitch or hemming stitch that from the inside you can see that almost candy cane striping along that folded edge. From the outside it's just a series of small pick stitches. So the last sample that we'll work on for hand stitching is the suture stitch, also called the mattress stitch or the baseball stitch. This is really good for repairing things that you can't necessarily get to the underside of it. So say the main drape in the theater. Often we'll use this kind of stitch to bridge together a tear or a rip in something that's too big to fit under a machine. Or if you have a rip in furniture or something like that. It is a visible repair. So unlike other samples where you're working in a fold or you're working in a seam, this is meant to pull together two pieces of torn fabric, but because the fabric doesn't have a seam there to start, you don't have any excess. And so what this stitch does is that it uses the thread of the stitch to kind of bridge the gap in the tear as a way to repair it temporarily before you could put a patch or something else on it. So you have your piece of red floral fabric, and the first thing you'll do is create your own tear. I'm not having you guys draw a line, but I am having you go nuts on this fabric. So you are going to cut about a 4 to 5 inch gash with your seam ripper. So putting your seam ripper into the fabric and then holding it tight to the table, you're just going to shred and push through, tearing it with your seam ripper. We want to get that kind of gash quality that you would if you had something get torn by a piece of scenery or by a heel or by something like that that could really destroy your fabric. And we're just going to pull out some of those little shreddy pieces. So once you have your gash done, you're going to go ahead and thread your needle, much like your other samples, where you will thread double and then tie your ends together. In the time of COVID, it would be easier just to lick your thread so that they go through easier, but these days we don't do that necessarily, so you can use your needle threader if that makes it easier for you. I'm using a contrast thread for this sample so that you guys can see, and you guys will do a contrast thread so that I can grade, but just know that when we do this for realsies, you will use a thread that matches the fabric of what you're sewing. So now that I'm knotted, I'll talk you guys through how to approach your stitching. If I were left-handed, I would hold my fabric so that it kind of folds over my non-dominant hand or my right hand, and I would keep my needle in my left. This is not a sample that needs to have tension necessarily, so you could start close to you or you could start away from you, but the important thing is that you want to be able to have a little bit of security to your fabric so that you're not trying to like fight the floppiness of that gash. So if you're holding it in your hand, you're keeping it so that the gash lays nice and flat, or if you're putting it on the table, you're making sure that you're not letting this get stretched or pulled apart. There's not the seam allowance to allow us to pin this. So for left-handing, I'll hold the needle in my left and I'll work either away from myself or towards. And for right-handed folks, same deal, is I'll keep my needle in my dominant hand and then either I'll stitch up and be able to see it, or I'll keep it down on the tabletop. But often I tend to start close and work away from myself just because I find that easier. But find a thing that's comfortable for you. So to start our stitch, just on the edge of the tear, we're not going to go right next to it. We're going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away, and we're just doing that small little pick stitch through to the right side. And that's just going to hold our thread in place. And remember, you have those two different ways to do your double lock. One is that you will put your needle into the fabric, and while it's still in there, you'll wrap twice, and then holding your threads together, you can pull tight, and by holding your threads, it kind of keeps it nice and neat. Or you could do the loop. So now that I have my thread coming out of my fabric right close to my tear, but not next to it directly, now I'm going to start my stitch. So it doesn't really matter which side I start on, but 1/8 of an inch up, I'm going to go into the gash and stitching from the underside, and about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, I'll stitch from the underside up and out. So I'm going into the gash and stitching up and out. And I'll pull my thread tight enough to keep my double threads nice and even, but without scrunching the fabric. And now I'll move to the opposite side, and I'll go 1/8 of an inch away from that first stitch. So I tend to sew double-handedly, so that way I can show you guys the two directionalities. But right now I'm stitching from the underside up and out, and I'm keeping my stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from that torn edge. And then jumping up 1/8 of an inch again from that last stitch. So you can see that as I'm latticing back and forth, my stitches are 1/8 of an inch away from each other, but on each side they'll become 1/4 inch between the two. So keep those in mind. Now I'm going over to the right hand side, 1/8 of an inch up from that last stitch, but 1/4 inch up from the stitch that was before it on its same side. And while you're working, you're just making sure that you're not letting the fabric ripple or be stitched unevenly from side to side. You're trying to avoid this from happening. You see how like one side could become shorter than the other? So this stitch is about watching your work and making sure that as you're grafting these two sides together again, that you're making sure that the fabric is just meeting, just touching. Because this stitch goes underneath the fabric and then comes up over top, it creates like a shoelace effect. And as that thread twists from the underside to the top side, it creates a barrier that keeps the fabric from overlapping. If it were to overlap, then it would start to create a ripple because there isn't actually enough fabric there to make a seam. And this is why this is a good repair stitch, is that it grafts two torn pieces together without the need of creating a seam. So then from the right side, you can see these little kind of pigeon toes of stitches working their way. And then from the right side, all you'll see are those same little stitches in their inverse. So when you're working, you want to make sure that you're pulling your thread tight. See how some of these are a little bit loose? You're pulling your thread tight, but you don't want to pucker it. You don't want to scridge this together. So you can see with this sample, part of the reason why we don't go too close to the torn edge is that actually if it frays more, then our stitches would disappear with it. So that's why we're living in that kind of 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch kind of world to make sure that our stitches can stay secure in an edge that is insecure. So once you complete all of your stitches, you'll do another little double locking stitch right past the tear. So on the wrong side of the fabric, you'll take one more pick stitch to the outside and you'll pull that tight, and that just sets the location for our knot. And then you'll take another knot or another stitch. And so last time I demoed the technique where you loop your thread around, so this time I will do the technique where I make a loop. Remember that both are acceptable and depending on what's easy for you. So I've gone through that loop twice and I've pulled it tight. Now as a fabric sample that only has the one layer, we can't sneakily trim our thread tail. So this is one like the running stitch where we'll just trim our thread tail close, but not so close that we can compromise our knot.